Hey, what's up? This is Darkbblue, aiming to enable everyone to enjoy games in depth. In this video, I'll give you an overall introduction to the combat of Elden Ring. We'll be talking about the 3 pillars and 2 additional factors and how they work together. By the 3 pillars, I refer to 3 typical combat styles in not only Elden Ring but also almost every Souls and Souls-like game. Interactive combat means allowing enemies to attack freely and trying to address each incoming attack. The most typical way is to time your dodge rolling, but in Elden Ring you have much more abundant choices, which we'll cover later. Buff stacking combat means you stack all kinds of permanent and temporary buffs such that your character is so strong you don't need to care about how enemies attack. You can either tank all the damage or kill bosses instantly. Controlling combat exploits all stun mechanics and beyond to keep enemies stun locked. In this way, enemies won't be able to attack. Apparently, the key difference is how you treat enemies' attack. You can choose to read the attack and time your evasion, you can ignore it, or you can prevent enemies from performing any attack. As for the 2 additional factors, they are add-ons to the 3 typical combat styles. On one hand, some enemies have special weaknesses beyond the general game mechanics. For example, Revenant can be damaged by healing incantations, and Mohg and Morgoth can be stunned by their shackles. On the other hand, some special advantages of your movesets are useful in dungeon crawling. They can be range attack, AoE attack, or moveset that can send you towards an enemy quickly and kill it before other enemies can react. I think the meaning of the 2 additional factors is clear enough, so next I'll focus solely on the 3 pillars and give you some more detailed explanation. However, do note that this will still be an overall introduction, and I'll later make individual videos to discuss each of them more in depth. So let's start with interactive combat. Basically, you need 4 steps to analyze and design an interactive strategy for a new enemy you've never seen. First, observe what attacks this enemy has. Then try to understand how these moves are chained together according to certain rules. Next, find out a suitable method to evade the attacks, and finally, select a way to counterattack. Among the steps, the first and last are quite straightforward, but the other 2 steps are tricky. So if you understand how enemy movesets are interweaved together according to certain rules, it's possible to in turn exploit the rules to influence how enemies attack. It means you can lure them to use attacks that are easy to counter and so on. And when choosing evading methods, it's important to know that you have many choices beyond the basic dodge rolling. You can use Winded Crystal Tear to enhance your rolling's iframes. Use Raptor of the Maze to gain significantly long iframes. Use Bloodhound Step to cross very long distance. And use Backstab and Spontaneous Guard for shorter recovery frames. It's quite often that a well-chosen evading method can greatly reduce the difficulty of interacting with a specific enemy. This is just a brief introduction to interactive combat and the 2 most important things to know about it. We'll talk about this in detail in an individual video. Then as for buff stacking combat, Elden Ring gives you a lot of buff choices. You can gain permanent buff from talisman and even some armors and weapons. You can also use spells, items, and some skills to gain temporary buff. Of course, some buff cannot coexist, so stacking buff is in fact a bit troublesome. Although the concept of stacking buff is really plain, practicing it does require some training. I'll focus on how to train yourself more efficiently in the video for buff stacking combat. Next, we have controlling combat. Elden Ring provides you with very abundant stun mechanics. In fact, I always say that stun mechanics are an important aspect where FromSoft games are much better than Souls-like games. One mechanic is called damage level, which is not accumulative, meaning that as long as an attack can stagger a specific enemy, it can always stagger it. It implies that Strategies based on damage level will always hold true from New Game to New Game Plus 7. However, most large enemies cannot be staggered with damage level, making this mechanic mostly for human-sized enemies. As a supplementary mechanic to damage level, triggering a status effect will also inflict stagger to enemies. Not all enemies will be staggered, basically only those damage level staggerable enemies will. This mechanic gives light weapons whose movesets have relatively weak damage level a supplementary approach to stunning enemies. For large enemies, you have Stun's mechanic, which is accumulative. By accumulatively reducing the enemy's stun bar with multiple attacks, you can eventually stagger them, creating a chance for critical hit. Do know that your stun's damage will get lower as you approach higher New Game Plus N rounds, so this mechanic will get harder to exploit. You don't necessarily need to stagger an enemy to control it. Some enemies have fixed moves, mostly used when they approach a certain HP percentage. Although these moves are attacks, being fixed means it's possible to exploit them. A very typical example is the fight against base game Radon. He has quite many fixed moves, during which you can do much damage, enough even to kill him. I'll discuss in more detail about these mechanics and how you can weave them together into practical strategies in the video for controlling combat. Now before I close this video, there's one more thing I want to mention. In Elden Ring, you need to combine the 3 pillars and 2 additional factors together to craft practical strategies. This doesn't always hold in other Souls and Souls-like games, but it does in Elden Ring. So let's see an example of Mohg. First, I know he has a special weakness that he can be stunned by his shackle, which creates a window for attack at the start of the fight. Then I know Mohg has fixed moves, where he will use this Spilling Blood attack 3 times before he can enter the second phase. This time is enough for me to break his stuns as long as I intentionally use attacks with high stuns damage. So this part of the fight is controlling combat, giving me longer time to attack after the shackle's effect ends. All this special weakness and controlling gave me very long time to deal damage, so it's a good choice to stack some buffs to finish Mohg in the first phase. Then this part of the fight is buff stacking combat. And lastly, note that I walk to the left side of Mohg during his Spilling Blood attack, which allows me to stay safe without having to roll. So this is a technique within the scope of interactive combat. Apparently, this entire strategy won't be so effective if any pillar of the 3 is missing. But we need to admit that combining different combat styles is a bit demanding. So there will also be an individual video talking about how to combine them together in practice. In conclusion, I hope this video can give you some general sense of the combat framework of Elden Ring. We'll be talking about details in future videos. If you want to join me into depth of games, remember to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, see you around.